from our nation's capital. This is Washington Week. And now here's moderator Gwen Ifill.
Tonight, one big story. Disaster follows disaster on the Gulf Coast. The destruction, unbelievable.
I just prayed the whole while the water was rising, hoping that everybody would be all right.
I still haven't been able to really cry. I'm just so still shocked and just exhausted because we have nowhere to go.
It's depressing. We have to start over, and we don't know where to begin.
The human toll, unspeakable.
People couldn't leave because they couldn't afford to leave. Superdome people went in that shelter because they couldn't afford to leave. And now we're dying?
Not one time did I see or anybody see an official step out here and talk to these people.
This is America? You hear about this in foreign countries, not here.
Tonight, we examine the drowning of an American city, the Gulf Coast in peril, and the government's chaotic response. Covering this story, Michael Duffy of Time magazine, Alexis Simendinger of National Journal, Jeffrey Birnbaum of The Washington Post, and Gloria Borger of CBS News and U.S. News.
Here again is moderator Gwen Ifill.
Good evening. With a death toll certainly in the thousands and a misery toll far higher than that, this week's Gulf Coast disaster has been nearly beyond comprehension. As we gather here tonight, the questions remain more plentiful than the answers. At the top of the list, how could this happen in America? And could it have been avoided? One of the most frustrated local officials was New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin, who nevertheless led President Bush on a tour of his damaged city this afternoon. But last night, the mayor shared this harsh assessment of the federal response with New Orleans WWL radio.
After 9/11, we gave the president unprecedented powers, lickety-quick, to take care of New York and other places. Now, you mean to tell me that a place where most of your oil is coming through, a place that is so unique, when you mention New Orleans anywhere around the world, everybody's eyes light up. You mean to tell me that a place where you probably have thousands of people that have died and thousands more that are dying every day, that we can't figure out a way to authorize the resources that we need? Come on, man.
The storm crashed ashore Monday, but here we are on Friday night, and people are still sleeping, despairing, and even dying on the streets of New Orleans. So, Michael, what has the government response been?
Well, it's been very slow in coming, and even tonight, the city is not yet secure by any means, and it may be another week before it is. The criticisms of the government really range not just from the federal government, but also the state government and the city of New Orleans. It's been really a total system failure across the board for the people who are supposed to protect the people who live in the region, with 80% of New Orleans underwater, with the casualties perhaps expected to top 10,000 within a week or so, and by some estimates, and the prospect of many others just missing and unaccounted for. You have a situation that the government shows over and over just how it couldn't really cope with this disaster, and it doesn't really have a plan going forward to do it yet. That's, I think, the most worrisome thing at the moment. And I think what's most staggering to everybody is that the model of a large storm hitting this area had been tested and worked and looked at for years and years and years by governments of both parties at all levels, and still we end up with this result.
So it's amazing enough that there's not a plan going forward. We'll get back to that. But the fact that there wasn't a plan before, when we know there had been preparedness drills, there had been many, many binders of scientific reports written about the geological weaknesses of Louisiana in particular. Why didn't any of those drills prepare them? Why?
And they also knew that even a Category 2 or a Category 3 storm on the city of New Orleans would result in many thousands homeless for months. They knew all this, but right. We're dealing with a part of the country that isn't particularly sort of impervious to playing. New Orleans is a city whose motto might be no worries. Louisiana is a state whose sort of political culture is, well, it's certainly storied in its corruption. And the federal government, which has to work in tandem, has been, let's just say, looked at its homeland security issues for the last 5 years through the prism not of natural disasters, but through the prism of terror. And so we are well prepared for events which, or presumably well prepared for events which we don't know whether occur. But when it comes to events which we kind of knew would occur at some time, it turns out we're not very well prepared at all, which is another real wake-up call and another head snap just 4 years after 9/11.
Well, Michael, who's in charge here? Or another way to ask that question is, who's to blame here, and who can we look to maybe getting New Orleans and environs out of this terrible situation?
Just winding back the clock on 9/11 and all the things that went wrong there with all the different agencies which couldn't talk to each other and wouldn't defer and deferred about responsibility. Once again, we saw that here. It was really Wednesday morning before people woke up. The governments across the board woke up and said, gee, we have a problem here. And even then they were hesitant to act because various people didn't know that they had authority. Again, it's a sort of bureaucratic mentality, really afflicts the governments at moments of crisis, and even more now really than it did 4 or 5 years ago. There was not the sort of initiative, not the sort of independent action that we came to see 4 years ago. But also, you have a department that's in charge of this, the Department of Homeland Security, which we know is really not a department at all. It's just a bunch of collected, grabbed agencies from here or there, and no one's really sure, who's supposed to do what, even now.
Can I give you one example, one small example of what you're talking about here that I heard about today? Al Gore happened to know a surgeon who was trapped in Charity Hospital in New Orleans and made an effort to try to figure out, he knew this surgeon because he had operated on his son, and tried to make an effort to arrange a private plane, started earlier this week, and is using his own personal funds, got 2 American Airlines planes, got hospitals in Chicago and Knoxville to agree to take not just Charity Hospital patients, but hospitals in New Orleans, patients in New Orleans, anywhere that they could be dispatched so that they could be picked up by private airplanes, and ran into a problem at FEMA after trying to figure out through talking to the deputy and everybody else, because FEMA has a requirement that it has to be requested from a federal department, and you have to have a special number to transfer one patient on a private conveyance.
Were there a lot of mix-ups like that?
Lots, and even, for example, the FEMA can't give assistance at the moment to for-profit hospitals in the city. It can only help hospitals which are not-for-profit because of some silly rule they have. And I think what really makes this a sort of national disaster as opposed to just a regional one is we're dealing with 2 states here, Louisiana and Mississippi, that have the 2 highest poverty rates in the nation. Half the children in both states are living under the poverty line. That means that for every city, really from Harlan in Texas all the way on an arc over to Tallahassee, 200 to 300 miles inland now, you are going to have literally refugees moving north, putting stresses on communities, schools, healthcare systems. This is really a much more national problem than one that we've seen before in a more isolated hurricane. And of course, then when you add to that the fact that this is also the center of our oil production, or 1/4 of it, it really puts a stress on the entire nation.
So, Mike, what are the sort of things they've got to do right away? I mean, Louisiana Senator Mary Landrieu said there's got to be a cabinet-level czar, a Rudy Giuliani-like person to take charge of this.
We may see that very quickly over the weekend from the administration. We also, I think, there's supposed to be 30,000 troops in New Orleans by the end of the weekend to reestablish order there. But that says nothing of the devastation across the Gulf Coast, which is a
we're so focused on New Orleans.
New Orleans.
Mississippi is in such bad shape.
Looks like Hiroshima.
Straits as well. Right. Thanks, Mike. All eyes turn to the president this week. His began in Crawford, Texas, and ended today touring the stricken Gulf region with local officials. In Biloxi, Mississippi, Mr. Bush said the damage viewed up close was, quote, worse than imaginable.
I don't think anybody can be prepared for the vastness of this destruction. You can look at a picture, but until you sit on that doorstep of a house that used to be, or stand by the rubble, you just can't imagine it. This is a huge task that we're dealing with. And our jobs as people in positions of responsibility is not to be satisfied until the job is done as good as it can possibly be done.
So, Alexis, does the president think the job has been done as good as it can possibly be done?
The answer is no, and I think I should add maybe the answer was no this morning when he left the White House, because the quote was that the results are not acceptable. That's what the president said. It was the first hint of criticism from this president after, obviously, 4 full days.
Then he furiously backpedaled by the time he got on the ground.
And by the time he got on the ground, he wanted to clarify, and reporters asked him to clarify what he was talking about. And he said that the results in Mississippi were acceptable, and what he meant was that in New Orleans they weren't, except for the U.S. Coast Guard, because they had lawlessness. These are the things he focused on, and that food, water, medicine was not getting, obviously not getting to the people who needed it in New Orleans. But that he didn't want to criticize. He said, I don't want to denigrate anyone. So in this president's world, this is, when you lead, you're trying to bolster people and buck them up, and you're trying to encourage and comfort, and that was his idea of his role today.
Cheerleader in
That's
chief.
the last we're going to hear, I believe, of the president's tiptoeing towards overt criticism of the results.
Why didn't he get there sooner?
He didn't get there sooner. You mean personally going to the location?
Feet on the ground.
The president has gone through hurricanes before. All presidents have gone through natural disasters before, and their first instinct is to get there as fast as they can. And the logistics are something that they worry about in terms of the impediments that they present to the disaster areas themselves. So right away, earlier this week, when the White House was talking about the briefings that the president was having, now mind you, these were briefings while he was traveling on the West Coast, talking about Iraq and other topics. When they started to realize that the president needed to talk to the governors, that they wanted to go to the area right away, and that they started to talk about the end of the week. So from the time that we all knew that this was, watching on the television, this was a devastating disaster, they were talking about the end of the week, and that's the schedule they stuck with.
Did I sense this morning in watching the president some frustration on his part about the fact that some of the aid wasn't getting through to those people in New Orleans? Or was it a frustration at the fact that we were focusing on the fact that the aid wasn't getting through?
Well, the president is not used to being criticized for not being a leader who's presenting the results. And so some of the frustration is that this was not happening. He's also clearly frustrated at the pictures, and he's getting earfuls minute by minute from everybody on the ground. But the other thing is, by the end of the day, the president went back to the discussion about progress and wanted to say we're making progress, and clung to something to announce at the end of the day by saying that order had been restored at the convention center in New Orleans. So,
where there are still, as we speak, thousands of people on the street.
Because U.S. troops had arrived. So yes, the frustration is there, and I think it's a real mix of being the commander-in-chief, being the consoler-in-chief, and finding that by the time you get there, you're being booed.
He also said this week that someone asked him at one point whether we needed foreign assistance, and he said, no, we don't. Is he not able to take help?
The president...
that surprised me, that answer.
Even the Secretary of State admitted that it is not the normal course for the United States to be on the receiving end of international help. But by the end of the day, when Condoleezza Rice had a news conference at the State Department, she was talking about the elements that they put together at the State Department to sift through more than 60 nations' offers of assistance and to do triage about...
They're sending them to the Red Cross, I think she said.
And trying to decide where those offers should best go and which ones to respond to. So that had changed over the course of 48 hours, 2 days.
What about the reaction inside the White House? We've heard the president trying to keep a bold front out, but internally, are there people more worried about what is clearly a disaster that will probably hurt the president unless he shows some better results?
It's so clear that the White House initial reaction from talking to officials and listening to them talk to us, that they don't want to own up to anything that is their failing or the executive branch's failing. And they feel that criticism or questioning about this, their initial reaction has been that that's playing politics, that that's what's really happening when you're calling into question the activities of the executive branch.
But Republicans are doing it. Would Republicans be playing politics by criticizing Mr. Brown, the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, for saying that we didn't know people were at the convention center?
Well, and clearly some of the Republicans are questioning whether FEMA is the right organization as swept into DHS, into the Department of Homeland Security. But I just want to say that when we look forward, there is, however good this gets in the end, we will always, and the president knows this will be the black eye on his record one of the worst stumbles of his administration, and they know that however they recover for the people, this is on the record books as a really a debacle for this
And the Iraq deployment, in their opinion, is still justifiable, even given the fact that it doesn't seem like we can fix things at home.
Well, the president today was asked about that, and in terms of whether there was any interrelationship to the weakness of response here, to the feeling of putting strength there. He said absolutely not. He disagreed with that he felt that he was protecting the United States and Iraq.
Okay, thanks, Alexis. The Gulf Coast destruction is already having an expensive ripple effect in regions of the country that never saw a drop of rain. Gas prices, which had been climbing slowly, shot up. The president hinted today that it may get worse as soon as this weekend, but that's just where the economic hit begins. Isn't that right, Jeff?
That's right, Gwen. The hurricane has hit us all. It certainly has touched our hearts, but it's also going to impact our pocketbooks, everyone, I think. We all are, I think, painfully aware that it's affected the price of gasoline and the price of oil. We know that as Michael pointed out, a quarter of our oil and gasoline comes from that region, and it's not been coming to the right places. There have been shortages all throughout the country, but it's actually a bigger impact than that. New Orleans and the Gulf Coast is a choke point for our economy. It's not just oil and gas, it's also railroads and shipping and highways. There are a large variety of products, from chemicals to plastics to oysters, that I think will be seeing increases in prices that will have a ripple effect through the entire economy, and the result will undoubtedly be that the gross domestic product, which has been going along perfectly fine, will be cut maybe in half. The result will probably be reduced consumer spending and increased inflation and all sorts of problems that I think we need to worry about.
After 9/11, there was a lot of discussion about what the fallout would be, or whether the president should ask for sacrifice or not. Here it seems clear that the sacrifice is kind of immediate, and therefore people will keep this stumble, as Alexis laid it out, in their minds a lot longer.
Well, I think that's exactly right. That the economy, which actually had been going perfectly fine for a while, is not going to be going all that well, and the result is that this is a storm that I think will be feeling for quite a while.
Now tell us about the price of gas. It did spike this week, and some of this has to do with the fact that not only are oil rigs shut down in the Gulf, but refineries, which line the littoral, are also shut down. Where's it going to go? How long is it going to take? They talked a lot when the president had a news conference this week. He talked about gasoline product. He had his oil man's hat really on his head.
Yeah.
I wasn't quite following it, so tell us.
Colonial Pipeline, talking about.
Tell us.
Right. Well, a couple pipelines were shut down for a while, but now they're back, and so everything seems to be flowing better that way. And believe it or not, today in international markets, oil and gas prices declined slightly. But I think
not at my pump.
Right. We were aghast not long ago at $2 a gallon gasoline. $3 a gallon gasoline is very common. I'm afraid we will see $4 or approaching $4 a gallon gasoline. They're all throughout the South, and I think in other places as well, there will be shortages and long lines at many gasoline pumps. So it will get worse before it gets better. But it will not get better anytime soon. Now, the federal government has tried to do better by releasing large amounts of oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and that was the reason for the decline in international markets today. But it will take a while before any sort of real benefit will get to the rest of us.
Now, one of the first things the president did when he got back to the White House was to set up a lunch with Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan. So what was that about?
Well, that's what you call a real power lunch.
Right.
And I think it's quite clear that there will be a disagreement between the president and the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Greenspan wants to continue to increase interest rates, as he's been doing for more than a year, to try to get back to a more normal level. That he reduced interest rates, remember, to save the economy after 9/11/2001. The president will probably want him to pause in that inching up of rates. And in a couple weeks, Greenspan has a decision again whether to increase those rates. I think that it is completely uncertain at the moment whether or not, as the President said when he came out of that lunch, that the economic problems from the Gulf are temporary in nature, and therefore the rates can continue to go up, or whether the severe problems in that choke point may lead to something that, at least the fear of, and I'll say the word here, Gwen, the R word, recession. I think people are worried about that. Now, analysts don't expect that will happen, but there is enough conversation that I think Greenspan may be forced not to increase rates as he would prefer to do.
Congress rushed today to pass a $10.5 billion spending bill for Hurricane Katrina relief, but the president acknowledged that's just a down payment. Still, the blame game has begun as members of Congress sort out responsibility and probe the touchy issues of race and class.
Many of these Americans who now are struggling to survive are Americans of color. Their cries for assistance confront America with the test of our moral compass as a nation. We cannot allow it to be said by history that the difference between those who lived and those who died in this great storm and flood of 2005 was nothing more than poverty, age, or skin color. It would be unconscionable to stand by and do nothing.
Now, Gloria, the president would look at that tableau and say, a bunch of Democrats criticizing me. It's all partisanship. Is it?
No. I think it is something very much more complex than just partisanship, Gwen, and this country is just beginning to grapple with the underlying story, which we've touched on tonight, and that is the fact that the people left in New Orleans were largely poor, were largely African American. Now they are destitute, and now they are dying. And they were not rescued in time. This country failed them. They couldn't afford a bus ticket out. They couldn't afford an airline ticket out of town. They couldn't afford a car ride out of town, so they were stuck, and nobody got them. You can blame the feds, you can blame the local government, you can blame the state government, you know, take your pick. But I think this is a conversation we have to have in this country, and it has started this week, may or may not be partisan in the end, who knows, about what our priorities are, what kind of people we are, where we are going to put our resources as a nation. And we've started hearing people talk about it. The fact that so many of those, a majority of those left in New Orleans were African American. Lots of people raising questions. Aren't the people fighting in Iraq? Aren't there African Americans fighting to defend this country in Iraq? If we can fix the electrical grid in Baghdad, can we fix the electrical grid in New Orleans? FEMA, national security issues. Where was the National Guard? Are they overextended abroad and therefore weren't here? So that is a conversation we'll have to have.
And what we do around this table is we try to have those conversations. We look to our leaders and say, okay, where's the leadership? What is the conversation we ought to be having? Have we heard anything back from them this week?
No, I think at this point the White House, as Alexis was saying, is very much on the defensive. As one can understand, very interested in saying things are going to get better, looking towards hope rather than looking back at despair. But I think this is an issue that people will raise, not only Democrats, but also Republicans from that region of the country. They're going, you know, the Democrats, though, in particular, are on terra firma when they talk about domestic policy, more than they were after 9/11 when they were talking about national security. After 9/11, the president had his bullhorn down at ground zero. Everybody was with him to get the terrorists. Well, there is no evildoer. Maybe it was our own incompetence, Gwen. I don't know, but lots of questions are going to be raised.
You know, Gloria, one of the things that popped into a lot of people's minds this week was absolute fear, because supposedly everyone in the nation was safer because of planning for disasters, whether they were man-made or terrorists or whatever. Is there a feeling that our political conversations, our policy conversations, what Congress is going to be talking about is reappraising that?
I think so.
Reassuring Americans.
We've already seen today, I got 2 press releases in my email today announcing oversight hearings about how Hurricane Katrina was handled and the planning for that. And of course, everybody's going to be looking for somebody else to blame. But you know, in the end, the buck stops there as Harry Truman once said, and it does. And at some point, somebody's going to have to come out and say, we messed up. This didn't go according to plan. I thought the president was beginning to say that this morning, but then, as you point out, he kind of turned it around.
One more brief question and answer.
Democrats, what will they be doing? Will they turn this into a partisan issue?
Well, you know, I think the Democrats right now are holding back. You know, this is something you want to talk about rebuilding if you're an American right now. You really do. You want to talk about rebuilding that part of this country. But it will become a partisan argument, and they will use it in terms of Iraq, and they will use it in terms of setting national priorities.
And it won't be going away anytime soon.
No, I don't think so.
Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, everybody. This has been a difficult week for everyone watching, covering, and experiencing the devastation wrought by Hurricane Katrina. Many of you would like to help. You can find a list of relief organizations on our website at pbs.org. Our condolences, prayers, and best wishes go out to the people of the Gulf Coast.